Test your mic.
Hello, hello. Yes, it's working.
So, Joe, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. So, you kind of have a very unique story in the way that you were in academia and joined a startup, and a hyper-growth startup at that. You've been at Airbnb for 8 years. I'd love to hear your origin story about Airbnb and how you ended up there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe start a little bit before Airbnb. I have a computer science degree from Northwestern, and I got really excited about, this was like maybe, I was a student in the late 90s, early 2000s, and got really excited about the interplay between computer science and biology. I got like obsessed that computers and biology start to look a lot like each other. And I, for some reason, thought it was a great idea to go get a PhD. And so I joined Caltech as one of their first bioengineering grad students. And it took about 7 years to finish that. Did not know what I was getting into with that. But academia, especially in science, is really interesting because it runs like a startup. You have a PI, he's kind of like the CEO. Instead of getting venture funding, you're getting government funding, and you're just trying to prove out stuff. So I was really excited about that, but I was a pure computational grad student. Half of my work was making a web app to make the algorithms I was working on a lot more accessible to the public. Something where a high school kid could design biomolecules. I haven't ever seen a use case where a high school kid needs to design a biomolecule, but that was like my mantra. And I liked the web work where everything from design all the way to building the hardware cluster. I liked that work way more than the actual hard science behind my thesis. And so I got really excited about joining a startup, and I decided I would move from Los Angeles to the Bay Area and like chase the Silicon Valley dream. It was very hard to do that because in LA, especially at the time, there was no tech industry. And in the Bay Area, none of the startups were talking to anybody that wasn't in the Bay Area. And I was like banging down the doors of startups, just trying to get someone to notice me. It was almost impossible. And I eventually found a company called Mint.com, personal finance. And I joined, told my PhD advisor that I was going to defend and go join the company. He's like, no, you're not. You got to finish your 3 more months of your defense. And so by the time I actually finished my defense, I had been acquired by Intuit. So I ended up joining Intuit. And but a few weeks in, I realized that it just wasn't for me. I really wanted to be at a startup. And it was kind of funny. And one day, my friend who lived in San Francisco was like, have you heard of this site called Airbnb? There's this random stranger staying in my house right now. And I was like, oh, okay. No, I haven't heard of it. I didn't think much of it. And the next day I was interviewing another company, and they gave me a ride. It was a Mountain View. They gave me a ride to the Caltrain, and the whole time talking about how awesome Airbnb was, and you should check out Airbnb. And the next day, I was on Hacker News. I was really big into that at the time. I saw a posting by our CTO co-founder, Airbnb is hiring. And I went to the website, and the first thing I saw was a Frank Lloyd Wright house that you could rent for less than a hotel. And my mind was blown because I lived in Los Angeles. I was obsessed with this Frank Lloyd Wright house in my neighborhood that I could never get into because it was closed to the public. And I was also a very avid couch surfer when I was in grad school because grad school doesn't pay so hot. And I was sold. I was totally into it. And I joined as the 3rd software engineer, 9th employee, when we were working out of an apartment like 2 blocks from here.
Wow, that's amazing. So you joined Airbnb, you're the 3rd engineer. What are your memories of working with the founding team early on? Like, how did you work together? How did you build anything?
Well, maybe I can talk you through what it was like. You'd go up. I mean, the first time I even stepped foot in the office, I was confused. I expected an office. Instead, I found an apartment. And the first thing you do when you enter the apartment is you take your shoes off. So that was the first thing. Like it was the first time I ever did an interview with my shoes off, which I thought was actually really great. And then I met, and then you walk into this room, and it's just so much energy, both like the way it's designed, but just the light of the room, and just so much optimism. And when I started working there, the product was being built by 3 co-founders and 3 engineers all working in this bedroom. and then the customer support team was in the living room. And when there was a bug, customer support would scream across the room, and then the engineers would fix it. Well, I would fix it. And that was like blissful. I've never actually been able to get back to that level of collaboration. And I think it's kind of like like those early days are like you'll never find org structures as simple and collaboration as simple as that. From that point on, it takes a lot more effort. But it was just really high energy and really exciting every single day.
Yeah, that's awesome. So the org starts to grow, gets a little more complicated. You transition to product.
Correct. One thing I should have mentioned was that I didn't really exactly understand what a product manager was, but Google, when I was still at Caltech, had recruited me to be a PM, and I had no idea until maybe 2/3 through my PM interviews at Google what a PM actually did. I did not get the job.
Typical.
But I knew I wanted to be that. But I thought I would learn more about product sitting next to two designers, Joe and Brian, two of the founders are designers. And I thought I'd learn more about product sitting next to two designers as an engineer and working with them than I would being like at Google or some other company as a PM. And back then we didn't have PMs. When you're that small, you don't really need PMs. And so they hired all their engineers, not to be necessarily like incredible technical masters, but really just to have good product sensibilities. And so I knew I wanted to transition to PM, and I had an opportunity as an engineer to actually do that work myself. And over time, I started to find that I'd work on bigger projects, and I was spending less and less time coding and more time, planning the roadmap and setting the vision and getting everybody together and making it happen. And at some point, it was just very organic.
Interesting. Was there anything in particular that was like really challenging to kind of pick up coming from the route you came through?
I think the real challenge was, and I had done a lot of that work. It wasn't called PM at Caltech when I built the web app and stuff like that. The real challenge is that transition to being a manager. I think that's the real hard one. And because obviously there's nothing about being an IC that ever really prepares you for being a manager, and it's in some ways such a different role in terms of how you spend your time. Like that's the hard challenge, and I'd be hard pressed to find anybody that's not a hard challenge for. It's just it's somewhat unnatural.
So this is your transition to like product leadership at Airbnb.
And it went straight from being an engineer to actually leading the product management team.
Oh,
and
wow.
so
Wow.
I didn't exactly know what I was doing at first, but I've always kind of tried to throw myself in the deep end of the pool and then just figure out a way to swim.
So what were some of the first things you focused on in this, plunge into the pool as a product manager? Like what was, when you took the reins, what did you feel like needed to be done, and how did you get it done?
I think one of the first things I did was start really building out the team. Mm-hmm. We went from 2 or 3 PMs and over a period of 4 to 5 years to about 70 PMs. Mm-hmm. And at that point, we'll get to this later, but we switched from a functional organization to a business unit organization. So my title is actually not VP of product, it's actually VP of experiences. I run the experiences business unit, including hardline reporting of product management and engineering.
So let's talk a little bit about that scale. You hire 60, 70 PMs. You told me that all org structures suck.
Yeah.
So, how do you think about the blurry lines and responsibilities of like a relatively large team that's probably looking to you for structure and answers all the time?
Yeah, that's advice that I had gotten along the way. That all org structures are fundamentally wrong. Is advice I'd gotten, I think it was from someone very senior at Nike at some point. And I think it rings true, is that no matter what you do at any stage, once you have any kind of scale, there is no perfect org structure, and everything at some point trends towards looking like a matrix. Mm-hmm. And you just kind of have to find out what works for your company. And the way we were set up is that we had an executive team, and each executive owned some strategic area, and they also owned a functional work. So I functionally managed the product managers, and then I ran a couple cross-discipline areas for the company. At some point, it got where the PM on a different team that I wasn't setting the direction for would have an issue and come to me, and I'm like, well, why don't you go straight to the person who's setting the direction? And that was kind of the moment where, okay, like we probably have to switch to a different org structure where it's more business unit based.
I see. And so we talked in the last panel about trust between EMs and PMs, but I imagine that's no different when you're an executive or a leader. Are there ways that you think about like nurturing that trust between your colleagues in engineering, design, leadership at Airbnb?
Yeah, and I would also say that I think my observation also is whatever happens at the top gets amplified as it moves down the organization. Yep. So if you're an org that has a PM leader and an eng leader at the very top and they don't get along and they don't have trust, I don't see how that's going to manifest well at other parts of the organization, like just through by 1,000 cuts, really. And so one thing that was amazing was me and Mike Curtis, our head of engineering, we got along so well together. And I think that there's a fundamental thing, which probably applies at all levels, is that we are so clear on what we are accountable for at the end of the day, that gives us such confidence to step into each other's roles when necessary. And so I'd be commenting a lot on the growth of the engineering team and how it should scale, and he'd be commenting a lot on lots of product stuff, and never once did any of us feel sort of threatened or in fact we welcomed it, and it always led to better solutions. And and the same is true with our head of design. We all, as a trio, we called ourselves Jam. Joe Bot, Alex, Mike, and our meetings were called Jam Sessions. I loved it. It was great.
Cool.
But we got along so well because we all so fundamentally respected each other and invested so well into that relationship. And there have been a couple times where things didn't go so well, and in terms of the output of the teams, and I can almost always trace it back to misalignment or miscommunication across the three of us.
And that investment takes the form of, I assume, more than just one-on-ones. It's time outside of the office. It's things that...
It's 1,000 things, 1,000 ways. It's just... the most fundamental barometer is what level of trust do you have, and the level of can you be incredibly vulnerable with that person and talk about your own weaknesses and feel comfortable. If you're at that level, it's probably the right place.
That's awesome. And so when you were talking before about the fundamental principles that you kind of manage your org, the product org, they sound pretty interesting. Can you talk a little bit about what those principles were and how you kind of led by those?
Yeah, I mean the most important principle that, and I still do I still onboard every PM with this kind of presentation, but the most important thing I'd always get across to every PM, and I think it's true for the entire company, is that the best products are a combination of art and science. And that is the fundamental tenet of product management at Airbnb. And that a world without science is very, you expect me as a scientist to be just all about science, but when people ask me companies I most admire, the company that's not Airbnb, the company I would always say was Pixar. Because Pixar always started with art and a really beautiful story, and then technology sort of brought it to life. But I never watched Finding Nemo and said, oh, that's great fluid dynamics. I always watched Finding Nemo and get lost in the story. And I think that's a great metaphor for how tech companies should work and the great product should be built, is that you allow for imagination and for soul and for humanity, and you pair that with incredibly rigorous validation and data.
How does that look in practice? What's a practical thing we can do to really bring more art in the craft where, we want to just measure, control everything, see the system? Are there tangible things that you do to really enforce that into the culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's also one of those things where it's 1,000 things, 1,000 ways, especially the tone that I set. So, one thing Brian tells me, I tell the entire team is, the second most important thing is hitting your numbers.
Yeah.
The first most important thing is you build something you're proud of.
Oh wow.
And we walk the product every week, every 2 weeks maybe, and where we will sit with all the senior PMs and EMs and walk through the product like a customer, or we'll all watch a video together, and we'll just ask ourselves are we proud of this? I don't care what the numbers say. Are we proud of what that customer is experiencing? And if we're not, we fix it, even if it comes the risk of slowing us down or something else. Because if you don't do that, and I won't say I've always operated this way, you accumulate a lot of debt.
Yeah. And when you say walk the product, this is the live product or features that are coming up?
So I would say both. With the app, we go through different flows, and I don't care who owns the flow, even if it's a different team. what's it like to sign up? What's it like to book an experience?
Yeah.
What's it like to, once you've booked one, what does the itinerary look like? And then we just find, I've never had a session where we haven't found at least 5 really important issues or bugs. And that's the online product. And that's one thing that's tricky with our business is that the product is technically offline. In the case of experiences, it's going into the real world and meeting somebody. That's the actual product. And so we have also set up programs where our employees on the team they have coupons to continuously dog food and take experiences. And they require, we'll give you a coupon to do it for free. You have to come back and post it in the Slack channel, and then also so everybody gets your feedback at all times.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we've talked before about the dangers of OKRs, and maybe it's related to what you were saying earlier. But I was wondering, why where are OKRs dangerous, and do you think they have a place in planning and context setting?
Well, the most dangerous thing is not having any goals. So OKRs are better than that. I think it's not so much that OKRs are an issue. It's this notion that there's only like 1, 2, or 3 metrics that matter.
Yeah.
And I've run teams like that before, and they're incredibly successful at optimizing those metrics. But when you do that, you can forget about the objective. But the other thing is, and I've spent some more time studying from like Amazon and other companies, that they look at a whole suite of metrics, and they have up to 10 goals at any given time, and they expect their senior staff to keep up to 10 goals in their head. And that's what we do on the experiences team. And on top of that, in terms of our dashboards, I look at about 60 to 70 metrics every single day.
Wow.
It's just what could be really dangerous, and it comes back to that being proud of it, is that you can optimize one metric here and then kind of convince yourself it's great without really looking at all the impact on the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And ways to balance that out. It sounds like the going through the flows is part of it. Are there other ways to kind of get people out of the numbers and think about the broader objective, what else they can do? Or
I mean, it depends on the business, but for our business, as I said, you've got to use the product constantly. And that means not the online part, the offline part. You got to meet with community all the time.
Yeah.
And I take one experience every single week. I've done about over 100. And it's very common that, and this can be overwhelming for a PM, but I recommend you do it. I give my email address to a lot of these hosts, and they have a direct line to me. And so often, they see something that none of us on our team will ever see. And I just value that feedback like gold. And it really helps, even if I can't reply immediately, it really helps shape the direction we're moving in. And when we were hiring Greg, who's from Amazon and runs our homes business, he said something to me which really stuck, which is, when the anecdotes and the data don't match, trust the anecdotes.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to constantly be finding tons and tons of anecdotes to make sure that the data makes sense.
Yeah. And when you're thinking about individual teams, how do you think about output versus outcomes and hitting those OKRs or maybe hitting those objectives? How do you inspire product managers and engineers to think more about just outcomes, whether they be measurable or something else, as opposed to just shipping?
Yeah, I think that that there's do you set a metric and create a strategy to hit the metric, or do you create a strategy and create metrics that are milestones along the way? I prefer the latter. As I said, I've done work before where the former was good. It's good to a point, but over time, it leads to very incremental work. So I'd prefer to have a team that picks a strategy that might be more long-term and then sets appropriate goals to hit it. All of us bought in that this thing might take longer to achieve, but will lead to a better outcome.
And so now in your role as the head of experiences, is it primarily like a business leader more than just the product leader running the whole group?
Correct. So, and it's, where I'm at in my career, I prefer to own all of something than just one function within something. Even if that thing is smaller, it's been a huge learning experience. So it's engineering, product design, all of that. But on top of that, it's also, my ass is on the line for customer support and for trust and safety and for all aspects of the business. Most of those aspects of the business I had a great exposure to. I mean, the experiences business is already way bigger than homes was when I joined Airbnb. Yeah. So I've kind of been through it all. So I'm able to take all these patterns and lessons and now apply them to the experiences business. But it's it's really fascinating, and it's becoming a great and even in across Airbnb, the PM career path is now starting to evolve into a business leader path or a category leader path.
Interesting. So that means you can be both a product manager growing into more of a business leader?
Correct. Yeah, and I think business leaders can come from anywhere, but I think that the senior PMs that report to me, I try to groom them to be, if that's what they want in their career, to be a GM or a business leader.
Interesting. And so, it's always hard for a startup to decide when it's time to just, build a new startup within a startup and have the discipline to allow that to happen. And I'm sure Airbnb, has tried this with experiences a couple times and maybe had all kinds of experiments they ran. Looking back on it, how do you think a startup can set itself up for success when it's trying to start a new startup?
That's a great question, and I think the reality is, well, first of all, most companies fail to get their first product out the door, let alone their second, and the challenge is a little different. Like a successful company trying to get their second business, the thing that's most likely to kill the second business is focusing only on the success of the first. So, this is where all of our business is coming from. We can't take our eye off the ball. There's so much opportunity, and then they miss the wave, and I think we were great to get a lot of great advisors to help us figure this out. But Silicon Valley is littered with the tombstones of companies that couldn't catch their second wave, whereas there are other companies like Apple that were able to really produce hit after hit. And you have to have this willingness to have some amount of sacrifice, both in terms of real estate on your product, growth on your product, but your core product, but also even mind share of the business. And something else that has to happen is, if it's truly your second business line, not just like a new exciting feature, but truly your second business line, it really has to have the CEO at the helm. And so Brian and I put together a team about several years ago to build experiences we started with 4 people, and we really focused heavily on it for a number of years, but without him, and then at some point he moved on to look at the entire company, but put me in as a business leader. But without the CEO really championing it, it's very hard for a second business to get off the ground.
Was there anything that happened before that where you tried things? Was it a side project before, or second class citizen?
We tried a lot of things. I think it's really hard. You could have these ideas like side projects and stuff, but it's not going to really hit and become something meaningful until the company and the executive team, everybody commits that this is going to be the thing and we're going to bet big on it. And it takes that, from at least my experience, for something to really be successful.
And so is there any way in which experiences from a cultural standpoint, maybe particularly as it relates to the topic at hand and engineering product collaboration, is any different from Homes or the other teams? Have they kind of built their own kind of culture as a result?
We're really thoughtful about the culture of Airbnb. And so we one Airbnb, we bring the whole company together at times, and so we really believe in that. But yeah, I mean, every team, even sub teams within businesses, can kind of create their own sort of mini culture. It's a very different kind of problem. So when something is really big, you have a lot more. You think about it really differently than if something is small. Like I'm at our business experiences is at a place where we can take bigger risks and we can take bigger growth losses because it's brand new and it's. And in fact, we want to take those risks because we want to fix things before it gets scaled, because once something is scaled, it's really hard to retroactively fix the broken things you wish you had done earlier.
Yeah. Is there anything as it relates to, say, the product engineering design relationship that's just been true since the day you joined Airbnb? It's just held true since?
I mean, at no point in the history of the company, and I think this was happening in tech before, around the time where Airbnb was started, where PMs would throw things over the wall to engineers like that. I've just never experienced that at Airbnb. We never would let that happen. From day one, when we were in that small apartment, we're all super collaborative. And even today, I can't imagine a world where I call a Moses PM, where they go up to the mountain, bring back commandments. We would never ever allow that. And we certainly, when I managed all of PM, I certainly wouldn't allow PMs to do that.
So Airbnb is known for trying to create magical experience for its customers. Very narrative-driven company, very inspiring place. How do you think about inspiring your teams when it's time, and how do you think about structuring it? Is it probably narrative driven, but really, what are the things you look for when it's like, okay, now it's time to really get the teams moving?
It's one of those other things where there's no like single way to do it. You have to it's 1,000 things every day. A couple tricks I have. I write a weekly email to my team, and I let anyone in the company subscribe. So like at least right now, at least a third of the company reads it every week. And I do it religiously. I've done it religiously every single Sunday, Monday for the last 3 years. And it talks about, here are the things I'm working on. Here's what, here's some shout outs, but I always end with some story of inspiration. And it's usually something I experienced, I've taken, a lesson I've learned from the community. And what's really funny is that the reason I do that has not necessarily been to inspire people. Yeah. It's because I'm actually an introvert, and it's sometimes hard for me to think on my feet. And so when I write things out, I'm like a lot more sharp when people ask me questions, and I've also like articulated how I want to say something. And so I do that on a weekly basis, but I find that that's one example of something that's constant. And then there's also like moments of writing narratives, and there's also moments of when we first launched experiences, or even internally announced experiences. Brian and myself and the team, we created a video of the first person taking experiences, and someone coming from Chile to San Francisco, and we showed what it was like to do mass-produced tourism and get in the big red bus, and then we showed what it could be like to do our experiences. And it wasn't like staged. It was a real experience.
It's the Francisco video.
It was our
right?
first one. What's
the
that?
Francisco video.
It's a Francisco video.
That wasn't staged.
That was not staged.
Okay.
Yeah. We designed it. We designed it for him, but he had no idea what he was getting into.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's cool. I want to make sure the audience gets time. So, if there are any questions from the audience for Joe.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I have two questions. One is on the OKRs, what you pointed out, that it is more important to measure more metrics than one. So is there any difference in measuring it at the organization level? Like I run an education startup, and should at the organization level, like CEO level, should you have only one metric, and then when it goes to the product, it should be more metric what you measure? The second question I have is about actually, I just lost the chain of thought, so you can just ask.
Why don't I answer the first one if it comes to you? I think if I get more even into it, and I want to be clear on the OKRs, it's not the idea of setting goals and stuff, it's just making sure you're not too narrow in the things you measure. If I go one level deeper, it's really important to separate output metrics and input metrics. I think at the CEO level or the business unit level, like it's nice to have like a handful, maybe 4 or 5 output metrics, but then it's important to have a suite of input metrics, because sometimes your output metrics can be very laggy, and you want to look at the inputs. And inputs are usually things that are heavily controlled by the team, whereas outputs, like things like revenue, that's an output metric. It's very complicated, all the things that drive into it, whereas an input metric is a better representation of what you actually want to drive. And so I think at all levels of the company, every person should be looking at a suite of output and input metrics, and maybe setting a goal around somewhere like 7 to 10 inputs. And then like OKRs, it can still cascade, and it should. But the other thing, and this was advice that I took from Amazon, is, and I think it was also applied to OKRs, is like don't look for a perfect cascade. You're never going to find it. To like make it kind of work enough, but you're going to spend, I can't tell you how many times I've been in like super long meetings that are unnecessary because we can't make that perfect cascade. And by the time you figure it out, like it's too late. Did you figure your second question?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
So what's the difference between, you talked about the feature versus a second product? I mean, I run an education startup, and we have a couple of kind of different projects going on. So how do you decide whether something becomes a project or a feature or a major module in the current product versus you have to treat it as a completely second product, have a completely different team on it?
It's probably just how adjacent it is. Experiences is not monetizing your space; it's monetizing your time. It's a different product. Another thing that I worked on for a number of years was moving Airbnb into Instant Book. That was like the project I owned for about 2 or 3 years, and it heavily focused on it. That's more of a program or feature. I think either way they have something in common, and maybe one other piece of advice, which is it usually starts with a small seed of an idea. And I think the other piece of advice I would give is to plant seeds early, because by the time you need that plant to be grown, it's too late to start. And when you're so flustered with so many things happening, it's really easy to cut the idea of planting new seeds. And a new seed could be like a couple people working on something, and if it shows promise, you double down and put your weight behind it. But with my team right now, we have tons of seeds that we're cultivating, and one of those things is going to be the next big growth driver for experiences, or the next big category for experiences.
So just to kind of clarify, so what you're saying is before even you decide whether it's a feature or a new product, you should actually be experimenting long before that.
Yeah, and I don't know if I like the word experimenting because that implies like A/B testing and stuff like that. But I think, for example, with experiences, we very early on started a small team that started working on concerts, and we think live performance will be a really big part of experiences. And it's been growing, and now we've been putting much more and more weight behind it. And eventually, it will give birth to concerts, poetry, opera, theater, and it's going to turn into something really big. And by itself could be a giant business one day. And that's within just experiences. But the thing is, 3 years from now, I can't wake up and say, oh, we should try concerts now, because it's going to take a long time for that idea to develop and work out the kinks. So I say plant seeds. It's do things that will be so small you can't even really measure them with A/B tests. But just make sure you have enough of those things, and maybe like an 80-20 or 70-30 rule about how much time you're putting in those, or how much of your efforts you're putting in those versus the other thing is a good way to think about it.
Hey.
Yeah.
Joe. So you said originally that in the living room, you never reached back this level of collaboration between customer support and engineering team. But I guess this is something that you are constantly thinking about at Airbnb with few hundred and thousands of people. What have been the hack or the organization tips or anything that you found that has been helping you reach out or getting closer to what you had in the past?
Yeah, and I mean, the fundamental challenge, and this is true of any group, is that the number of communication lines grows quadratically with the size of the team. So by definition, the laws of physics make it hard as a team grows to put more, to stay more together. I think in terms of like how to keep everything like going really well together, I'm constantly evolving that. From my perspective, one of the things that's most powerful is for me to have a really cohesive leadership team. I mentioned before that if your head of engineering, your head of product do not work well together, I guarantee you're going to see that propagate the entire system. And so me as a leader, I have a leadership team, and we invest a ton in getting alignment and spending time together and finishing each other's sentences and building trust, and really thoughtful about who are the next people we bring on that team. So that's sort of one thing. But then also it's thinking about rings of leadership. So I have, outside of my directs, I have one other ring of anyone who runs any kind of function or market or category. It's about 50 people, and I have a weekly meeting with 50 people. It's not like a discussion meeting, but it's more of a weekly business review where everybody contributes this document, and we review the whole thing together, and I ask tons of questions, and people can ask me questions as well. And I have found that that's a really good way to share information across a larger team. And like, those are two examples, but I think the most important thing is just at the top having really close trust, and then also expecting that at every team. So if we have a team with a PM, an eng lead, and a designer, then we expect that team to also, that crew to also be super tight together. And when it's not, we dive in and find it. And when I find areas of the organization that are having problems working together, or I see signs that something isn't going right, the first thing I try to get at is, is there good collaboration between like the core unit?
Over here.
So kind of building on your point about the quadratic effect of the complexity as your team has grown, how do you balance the autonomy of the needs of these smaller groups that are the seeds, for example, and how that comes together maybe in the central functions where things have to get combined together, whether that's about the granularity of scheduling or whatever it might be, and bringing these kinds of things together, and there's tension between those kinds of shared functions and the need to have that independence and autonomy?
So if I understand your question, I mean, the way I interpret your question is like, how do we promote maximum autonomy just across teams, right? There's a couple things that are really important. One is to be really clear and be about like what is tops down and what's bottoms up when it comes to autonomy. And I tend to think that vision and direction are tops down, and strategy is bottoms up, and goals are kind of always in agreement between the team and the leader of the team. And I think that is happens at every part of the organization. That kind of idea that even a small team, the trio at the top, the design, engineering, and product manager sort of set the direction, but like the individual IC should be kind of thinking of the tactics and all the creative solutions to solve a problem. So that's one thing. But it also, when you're talking about how to make sure people don't collide, is that we're really careful to make sure that two teams don't own the same thing. Someone once told me that that no one's out there is really political. The source of most politics is when two people or two teams think they own the same thing. And so when we sniff that out, we try to solve that problem and then try to clarify, who owns what, and then even within a team try to clarify who's the DRI or the owner of something, because across a couple people, if they all think they own something, well, it's going to lead to some issues.
So I think we gotta close it out. Joe, I want to thank you very much for all the advice you shared tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think that's it for the content tonight.